Why would an entire town erase one story from its own archives? Who was Dr. Nathaniel Harlow, and why has his house stood empty for 100 years? Sometimes what we search for in the past is already searching for us. Autumn, 2024. Inside the crumbling remains of Ashbrook County Asylum, dust and silence pressed against the air like a weight. Journalist Ethan Cole, a local historian and true crime podcaster, had been granted special access to the hospital's sealed basement archives. Documents untouched for over a century. He expected dull administrative files and faded death certificates. Instead, he found a single gray folder without a label, tucked between boxes of patient logs. Across its cover, written in shaky pencil, were the words, "Drive N. Harlow classified material. Destroy after review." Ethan hesitated. The paper was brittle, edges curled with time, but curiosity overruled caution. Inside were photographs, medical charts, and half-burned letters written between 1908 and 1912. The photographs were the worst: sterile rooms lined with surgical tools, gas lamps casting sharp shadows, and in one picture, the blurred outline of what looked like a child's arm. The first document was a police report dated March 1912. It mentioned Dr. Nathaniel Harlow, once a respected Boston surgeon who had relocated to the small town of Ashbrook after tragedy, the death of his wife during childbirth, and the stillbirth of their infant. He raised 3 surviving daughters alone: Anna, Mary, and Catherine. Locals described him as a quiet man, withdrawn, but devoted to his research. As Ethan read further, the language in the documents changed. Cold medical terms twisted into something else: biological fusion, shared vascular integration, subject containment. There were pages from a nanny's testimony, a few lines from a surgeon's journal, and finally, a letter from the state governor ordering the materials sealed to prevent widespread panic. The air in the archive felt heavier with every page. Ethan turned one of the photographs toward the light. A dim operating room, a narrow iron cot, and something on it that looked almost, but not entirely, human. Beneath it, scrawled in fading brown ink, was a single line: Subject A, B. Successful vascular merge. Ethan's throat went dry. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury this story. And now, by accident or fate, he had just unearthed it. He closed the folder, but the image refused to leave his mind. In that moment, standing alone under the flickering light of the old asylum, Ethan Cole understood one thing. Whatever had happened in Ashbrook more than a century ago wasn't done with him yet. The road to Willow Hill wound through dying maple trees and fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. Ethan parked his car where the asphalt gave way to gravel and stepped out into the heavy quiet of Ashbrook's outskirts. The old house stood at the crest, gray, skeletal, its windows blind with dust. Locals called it the house on Willow Hill, though no willows had grown there in decades. He'd seen the property listed once in a 1930s survey map, marked with a single word, "Condemned." According to the town archives, it had belonged to Dr. Nathaniel Harlow until April 1912, when authorities sealed it following an unspecified domestic incident. There were no police reports, no public records, no obituary. Just that phrase, repeated again and again in old ledgers: house sealed, access restricted. In the diner that morning, Ethan had asked the waitress, an elderly woman with white curls and bright, suspicious eyes, if she knew anything about it. She'd frozen mid-pour. "Willow Hill? Lord, honey, you don't want to go poking around up there. That place has been empty since before my mama was born. Folks who tried to buy it never stayed long." "Why?" he'd asked. She hesitated. "Because they said they heard children crying in the basement. And once, someone saw faces in the upstairs windows." Not ghosts exactly, something worse. Something stitched together that shouldn't have been. Now, standing before the sagging porch, Ethan thought about those words. The boards creaked under his weight. The front door hung half open, its frame warped by rain and time. He pushed gently. It gave way with a sigh, releasing a smell of mold, rust, and something else. The faint sweetness of ether. Inside, the light barely reached the corners. Wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing older layers beneath. Patterns of ivy and roses faded to gray. A medical certificate still hung on the wall, glass cracked, name barely legible. Nathaniel Harlow, M.D. Harvard Medical College, 1896. He moved from room to room, photographing everything. In the parlor, overturned furniture lay in a pile of dust and rat droppings. In the kitchen, the sink had rusted into a red wound, and the door to the cellar gaped slightly open, as if someone had left it that way. Ethan crouched, shining his flashlight down the stairs. The beam stopped halfway, a wall of darkness swallowing the rest. For a moment, he could swear he heard something faint beneath the silence. Not wind, not water, a soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing. He blinked and the noise stopped. Only the drip of condensation echoed back. He exhaled shakily and shut the door. Not yet. Back in town, Ethan spent the afternoon at the municipal records office. A brittle folder labeled property transfers, 1910 to 1920, confirmed what he already suspected. The Harlow estate had never been sold. After the incident, the property reverted to state ownership and was marked as restricted under a legal clause citing potential biohazard contamination. Biohazard in 1912? It didn't make sense. He searched old newspapers next. Nothing. The Ashbrook Gazette from that spring skipped an entire week of publication. The microfilm reel had been cut, a clean slice, as if someone had deliberately removed that section. Late in the evening, Ethan stepped outside. The courthouse clock struck 6, and across the square, the fog was creeping in again. He glanced toward Willow Hill, its silhouette barely visible above the trees. For a second, the top window caught the fading light, and he could have sworn a shadow moved behind the glass. He told himself it was imagination. Old houses had ways of reflecting light, of making shapes where there were none. But as he turned to leave, his phone vibrated with a new email. No sender, no subject, just a single line of text. You shouldn't have opened the folder. Ethan stared at the screen, the chill settling deeper than the autumn air. Somewhere beyond the hills, the house waited, and it was no longer just history calling him back. Before his name became a whispered curse in Ashbrook, Dr. Nathaniel Harlow had been celebrated in Boston's medical circles. A pioneer of reconstructive surgery, known for his steady hands and unnerving composure under pressure. Colleagues called him the man who never flinched. Patients adored him. His reputation was flawless, until tragedy hollowed him out. In 1908, during the birth of their 5th child, his wife Alice died on the operating table. The infant was stillborn. Harlow never forgave the world for it or himself. Within months, he left the city, closed his private practice, and moved his 3 surviving daughters to the quiet town of Ashbrook, accompanied by a housekeeper named Agnes Wilson. The Boston newspapers called it a period of private grief. But what began as grief soon decayed into obsession. Among the papers Ethan had recovered from the archive was a torn notebook labeled Harlow, Surgical Log, Personal. The handwriting began neatly clinical. We are not separate beings. One entry read, we are a system, a network that can be perfected through unity. Another note, dated late 1910, death is only a design flaw. It can be corrected with the right combination of tissue and will. Ethan felt his stomach twist as he read. It was clear the man wasn't just mourning, he was engineering. The next file was a police statement taken from a neighbor, Mr. Edwin Palmer, dated February 1912. The doctor's daughters rarely play outside. The blinds are always drawn. At night, I've heard noises, not the sort one hears from animals. Crying sometimes, or someone calling for help. But when I asked the doctor, he smiled and said he was working with laboratory specimens. He's a surgeon, after all. Who am I to question science? Another witness mentioned seeing Agnes, the housekeeper, carrying buckets of water and bandages to the basement at odd hours. When questioned, she reportedly replied, "It's better not to ask." Ethan scrolled through scanned photographs on his laptop. One showed the family in 1909, taken on the lawn before everything changed. Dr. Harlow stood in the center, tall and stern, his hand resting lightly on the shoulders of two young girls. The third child, smaller, hid halfway behind her sisters. None of them were smiling. In the margins of the photo someone, perhaps an investigator, had written in pencil, "Subjects A, B, and C." Ethan shut the laptop. The air in his motel room felt too close, as though the past had followed him there. Harlow's words echoed in his mind. "We are not separate beings." He thought of the crying the waitress had mentioned, of the flicker behind the window on Willow Hill. If Harlow had truly believed in what he wrote, what had he done to those girls? The next file in the archive was marked "Anonymous Letter," received March 25, 1912. Its first line froze Ethan where he Saturday. "If you do not act immediately, the doctor will kill his children. He believes he can make them one." Ethan leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. The edges of the letter trembled in his hands, even though the air was still. Somewhere in the dark, outside his window, something creaked. A sound like an old floorboard settling. But the motel was a single story. There were no upstairs rooms. He turned off the light. Sleep wouldn't come that night. On March 25, 1912, a letter arrived at the Ashbrook police station. No return address, no signature. The ink had bled from rain, but the words were still legible, trembling with urgency. "If you do not act immediately, Dr. Nathaniel Harlow will destroy his children. The house on Willow Hill is hell." The sheriff at the time, Thomas Greer, filed it as an anonymous complaint. But even he couldn't ignore the town's growing whispers. For weeks, people had reported strange sounds drifting from the Harlow estate. Low moans, crying, the hum of machinery at impossible hours. When Greer and two deputies drove up to Willow Hill that afternoon, fog rolled thick across the yard like a living curtain. Dr. Harlow greeted them at the door. He looked tired but calm, almost relieved to have company. "Good afternoon, Sheriff. I assume this is about the noise?" Greer nodded, trying not to stare at the doctor's hands. Thin, pale, faintly stained with something darker than ink. "Just a routine check, sir. Folks been concerned." Harlow invited them in, his voice measured, polite. The house smelled faintly of disinfectant and something sweet. Ether, perhaps, or decay. Upstairs, he showed them two girls lying in bed, motionless beneath heavy quilts. "My daughters," he said softly. "They've been ill. Fever, nothing more. I've kept them confined for rest." Greer stepped closer. The girls' faces were ghostly pale. Their breathing was shallow, uneven. He noticed bandages peeking from beneath the blankets. "They under treatment?" "Just observation," Harlow replied. "You understand, I'm a physician. I'd rather not expose them to strangers." The nanny, Mrs. Agnes Wilson, stood quietly in the corner. Her eyes never met the sheriff's. When Greer asked if everything was fine, she nodded too quickly, whispering, "The doctor takes good care of them. When the sheriff requested to see the basement, Harlow's tone shifted. Still polite, but firm. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," he said. "That's my laboratory. There are chemical samples down there, unstable compounds, dangerous to untrained hands." Greer hesitated, then decided he had no cause for a warrant. "If that's the case, we'll leave you be, Doctor. But please quiet the equipment. Neighbors are worried." "Of course," Harlow replied, smiling faintly. "I appreciate your concern." That night, the deputies wrote in their report, "No criminal evidence found. Children appear unwell but alive. Basement not inspected per Dr. Harlow's warning." 3 days later, just after midnight, a woman stumbled into the police station barefoot and hysterical. Her apron was soaked in blood. It was Agnes Wilson. "They're alive," she kept repeating through tears. "Dear God, they're still alive down there." It took nearly an hour to calm her enough to speak. Then she told them everything. How the doctor had forbidden her from entering the basement. How she'd heard muffled crying that didn't stop for days. How, the night before, he'd finally called her down to assist with care. Her voice broke as she described what she saw. 2 of the girls, Anna and Mary, were on the table, their chests sewn together, stitches running from collarbone to stomach. They were breathing barely. I heard one of them whisper for her sister. He said it was progress. The room went silent. Sheriff Greer dropped his pen. Agnes began to shake uncontrollably. "He said he could make them one," she sobbed. "He said soon Catherine would join them. I ran. I couldn't stay another night in that house." At 3 a.m., Greer signed an emergency warrant. By dawn, the police wagons were on their way to Willow Hill, unaware that what waited in that basement would scar the town for generations. The raid took place just before dawn on April 3, 1912. Fog hung low across the fields, muffling every sound except the crunch of boots and the faint clatter of the deputies' rifles. Sheriff Greer led the way, lantern in hand, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. When they reached the Harlow estate, the house was silent. The front door was ajar, swaying gently in the wind. Inside, everything smelled of metal and medicine, iodine, blood, and something burnt. The men moved cautiously through the hallway until they reached the basement door. It was locked from the outside. Greer kicked it open. The hinges screamed. The beam of his lantern cut through the dark and stopped. The basement wasn't a storage room. It was a laboratory. Tables lined with jars of preserved organs. Shelves of notebooks. A surgical lamp still glowing weakly from a generator. And in the center, an operating table. On it lay 2 girls, Anna and Mary Harlow, joined from chest to abdomen, their bodies crudely stitched together with thick black thread. They were alive, barely. One of them moved her fingers, a faint tremor. The other's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. One deputy ran outside to vomit. Another whispered a prayer. In the adjoining room they found Catherine, 11 years old, tied to a cot, her skin pale from morphine. Fresh incisions marked her sides, unfinished work. And then they saw him. Dr. Nathaniel Harlow stood calmly near the far wall. His sleeves rolled up, his hands crimson to the wrist. "Don't be afraid," he said quietly. "You're witnessing the next stage of life. Step away from the table," Greer shouted. Harlow smiled, almost tenderly. "I gave them immortality. You simply don't understand." He didn't resist arrest. He even thanked them for coming. 2 days later, both Anna and Mary died despite every effort to save them. The doctors who examined them called it a surgical impossibility sustained by madness. Catherine survived, the only one left. The court deemed her unfit for questioning and sent her to the St. Agnes home for the mentally affected children in Augusta. Dr. Harlow never stood trial. On April 7th, he was found hanging in his cell, a strip of bedsheet twisted around his neck. In his pocket was a note written in trembling ink. The process has already begun. Their souls cannot be separated. More than 50 years passed before anyone in Ashbrook heard the name Harlow again. In the summer of 1964, county records show a property transfer, a small cottage built just a mile from the ruins of the old Willow Hill estate. The buyer's name, Catherine Harlow. Age 43. Occupation, none. No one recognized her at first. The townspeople assumed she was a widow or perhaps a recluse from the city. But the older residents, the ones who remembered whispers about the doctor and his girls, noticed the name and felt an old chill crawl up their spines. Neighbors described her as quiet, polite, always dressed in gray. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and every month, on the third day without fail, she would walk the narrow road to Ashbrook Cemetery carrying a bundle of white lilies. She stayed there for hours, standing before two simple headstones, lips moving in silent conversation. The local grocer, who sometimes gave her a ride home, recalled that her hands shook when she held the flowers, like she was offering them to someone still watching, he said. In the following years, Catherine's name began appearing in medical files again, this time at the Ashbrook County Clinic. Diagnoses varied: post-traumatic stress disorder, auditory hallucinations, somatic delusions. Doctors wrote about her complaints of phantom pain in her chest and abdomen, old surgical scars that showed no sign of ever healing. One entry from 1968 stood out. Patient reports sensation of multiple heartbeats when alone at night. Claims to feel movement beneath her skin, as if something inside is trying to breathe. Another note, scrawled in the margin. She says her sisters speak to her. During one appointment, a young physician asked her gently if she still dreamed about the house on Willow Hill. Catherine smiled faintly, eyes glassy. "Dream?" she murmured. "No, doctor. I don't dream about that house. It dreams about me." The physician never saw her again after that visit. By the early 1970s, her health declined. Neighbors said the lights in her cottage burned through the night, and sometimes they heard two voices inside when she lived alone. The police received no complaints. Only one note in a neighborhood log from 1973. Strange noises from the Harlow woman's house again. Sounds like children crying. No one ever checked. The cottage smelled of dust and lavender when Ethan finally stepped inside. It had been abandoned for decades, yet everything remained almost untouched, as if its owner had simply stepped out and never returned. Dust-covered teacups still sat on the shelf, a framed photograph of three little girls on the mantel. In the bedroom, beneath a cracked mirror, he found it. A leather-bound notebook, its cover warped with age. The first page bore a name written in delicate cursive. Catherine Harlow, 1958. The early entries were harmless, almost gentle. Notes about gardening, the weather, her loneliness. But soon, the handwriting began to tremble, slanting into desperation. "Anna says she's cold underground. Mary keeps calling for me. I tell her I can't come yet. Not until Father allows it." Ethan turned the page. Ink blotches stained the paper where tears, or something darker, had fallen. Drawings appeared between the lines. Anatomical sketches of torsos, veins connecting at impossible angles, handwritten labels, shared circulation, fusion seam, integration point. By 1971, the words no longer belonged to a single voice. The tone shifted between entries, as though multiple people were writing within the same body. "He visits me again in dreams. The cold of the scalpel wakes me before it cuts. They're not angry, only waiting. They want me to finish what he started. Anna whispers about the stitches. Mary cries. Sometimes I answer as father and they stop. Ethan read faster, pulse racing. The deeper he went, the more the language dissolved into fragments. Overlapping sentences, unfinished thoughts. One page contained only 3 words, repeated dozens of times. We are one. Near the back of the notebook, a folded hospital form was taped to a page. Ashbrook County Clinic, 1972. Diagnosis: dissociative identity disorder. Patient exhibits at least 3 alternating personalities: Anna, Mary, and self. A short physician's note followed. Patient's voice changes during episodes. Pulse and breathing alter as if separate organisms. Claims she can feel her sister's presence within her body. Ethan's hands trembled as he turned to the final section. The handwriting had grown jagged. The ink pressed so hard it tore the paper. I hear him in the basement. Father says it's almost done. He says the body remembers what the mind denies. If I listen closely, I can feel them moving beneath my ribs. The last entry was dated April 3, 1973, exactly 61 years after the raid on Willow Hill. They're calling for me again. Tonight I'll go to them. I'll bring the lilies. I think they're ready. And maybe this time we'll finally be whole. Ethan closed the journal slowly, his reflection fractured in the cracked mirror above the desk. Behind him, the wooden floor groaned, just once, like a breath drawn in the dark. After Catherine's death, the house on Willow Hill passed into county ownership. For nearly half a century it stood empty, boarded up and avoided by everyone in Ashbrook. When Ethan requested access for his research, the town clerk hesitated before handing him the keys. People say it's bad luck to open that place again, she muttered. If you hear something down there, don't answer. The air inside was colder than he remembered, as if the walls themselves held their breath. He made his way through the narrow hallway, past the same cracked mirror, down to the cellar door. The hinges groaned like a warning. Dust billowed with each step as he descended into the dark. The basement was smaller than he expected. A low, stone room with collapsed shelving and old bottles that had long since lost their labels. Still, something felt wrong. His flashlight beam caught a patch of brickwork on the far wall that looked newer than the rest. Too smooth, too clean. He stepped closer and ran his fingers over the mortar. It crumbled easily. Behind the plaster, the hollow sound of metal echoed. Ethan's pulse quickened. He grabbed a crowbar from a pile of debris and began chipping away until the bricks gave way, revealing a small recess sealed behind them. Inside sat a rusted metal chest, no bigger than a suitcase, the surface mottled with corrosion. He knelt, pried it open, and froze. The stench of decay and old chemicals spilled into the air. Inside were surgical tools. Scalpels, clamps, bone saws, their handles wrapped in cracked leather. A bundle of faded photographs lay beneath them. Ethan lifted one with trembling hands. 3 little girls in white dresses, their faces solemn. Someone had cut the picture into strips, then sewn it back together with black thread, the stitches crossing over their bodies as if binding them into one. Beneath the photos lay a notebook wrapped in oilcloth. The first page was dated January 1912 and signed, Dr. Nathaniel Harlow. The entries were written in precise, emotionless script. The physical union is only the first stage. The true merging will occur later, when the boundaries of the soul have softened. Anna and Mary show promising compatibility. Catherine will complete the triad. Ethan's throat tightened. This was no myth. It was evidence, raw, unfiltered madness preserved on paper. He turned another page. Sketches of organs, circulatory diagrams labeled integration conduit, shared vessel. The last entry stopped him cold. Even if my hands fail, the process will continue through her. The body is memory. The daughter will carry the design. Ethan sank back against the wall, the weight of the discovery pressing down like the air itself. Catherine had lived her whole life in this house, with her father's journal hidden only a few feet away. She must have found it. She must have believed it. He looked again at the sewn photograph, the black threads glinting in the beam of his flashlight. For the first time since arriving in Ashbrook, he felt something watching him. Not from the shadows, but from within the walls, within the quiet. He closed the chest and whispered, "I'm so sorry." But the air in the basement shifted, a faint rustle like fabric dragging across the floor. Ethan turned off his light. In the dark, he thought he heard 3 shallow breaths, in perfect unison. The county coroner's report was brief, almost evasive. Female, approximately 73 years old. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. But one paragraph caught Ethan's eye. Multiple fresh incisions along the abdomen and chest, consistent with post-mortem surgical activity or self-inflicted wounds. No evidence of struggle. Subject lived alone. Self-inflicted. The word clung to him like frost. He imagined Catherine, frail and trembling, cutting into herself under the same dim light where her father once worked. Was she trying to repeat his experiment? Or finish it? Ethan returned to the cottage the next day. The storm had broken overnight, washing the yard clean. The house was silent, but the basement door stood open, as though waiting. He descended slowly, flashlight trembling in his hand. The air was heavier than before, thick with damp earth. Near the far wall, the same wall where he'd found Harlow's journal, he noticed a patch of floor that looked disturbed. The dirt there was looser, darker, as if recently turned. He hesitated, then dropped to his knees. The first scoop of earth released a smell that made his stomach knot. He kept digging. A few inches down, his fingers struck wood. It was a small wooden box, its lid nailed shut. He pried it open with the end of his flashlight, and froze. Inside lay human remains, carefully arranged, fragments of bone, 2 small skulls. Their edges fused together with rusted wire and twisted metal clamps. Whoever had placed them there had done it lovingly, almost reverently. A folded piece of paper rested on top, written in shaky cursive. "They are together again. I will join them soon." Ethan backed away until his shoulders hit the wall. The beam of the flashlight wavered across the cellar, catching on old stains that might have been rust or blood. His mind raced. He could call the police. He could expose everything, the family, the town's silence, the horror buried beneath a century of denial. But as he stared at the box, something in him recoiled at the thought. This wasn't a crime scene anymore. It was a grave. He stayed there for a long time, listening to the stillness until he made his choice. The next morning, he contacted the local parish. He didn't explain. He simply told the priest there was a place that needed a blessing. That evening, under the faint glow of candles, the priest performed a quiet service in the basement. He didn't ask questions, and Ethan didn't answer them. The man sprinkled holy water over the spot where the earth had been replaced, murmuring prayers for 3 lost souls who never found rest. When it was over, Ethan stood alone in the silence. The smell of damp soil lingered, mingling with the faint scent of lilies the priest had left behind. He whispered to the dark, "It's over now." But somewhere beneath the ground, deep in the cold dirt, a soft crack echoed, wood shifting, maybe, or something else, stirring just enough to breathe. Ethan's flashlight flickered once and went out. Ethan left Ashbrook at dawn 2 days later. The fog hung low over the highway, turning the world into a faded photograph. Yet before leaving for good, he made one last stop, the old cemetery on the edge of town, where the Harlow sisters were buried. The grass was slick with dew, the morning air heavy with silence. He found the graves easily. The names had been worn by time, but the small granite stones still stood side by side. And there, laid neatly across both markers, were fresh white lilies. They couldn't have been, their long droplets still clung to the petals. The caretaker, an old man with a lantern and a wool cap, noticed Ethan standing there. He shuffled closer, lowering his voice as if afraid to disturb the quiet. "You're not the first to come looking," he said. "What do you mean?" The man glanced toward the trees. "Every month, same time, same flowers. White lilies. Been that way for years. I used to think it was some relative, but—" He hesitated. "Sometimes, I see them." "See who?" Ethan asked. The caretaker's eyes grew distant. "Three women, dressed in white, stand right there holding hands. Don't move, don't speak. Just watching. When I blink, they're gone." Ethan wanted to believe it was an old man's imagination. But the lilies were real. Their scent filled the air, faint, sweet, and unmistakably alive. He placed his own bouquet beside them and whispered, "Rest now." As he turned to leave, a chill rippled through the stillness. The wind brushed the grass, carrying with it something soft, a whisper, three voices intertwined, murmuring in harmony. It lasted only a moment, yet it froze him where he stood. When he finally stepped away, the clouds broke, and the first beam of sunlight touched the stones. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though three faint silhouettes stood there, hands linked, shimmering in the golden light before fading into air. That night, back home, Ethan dropped his keys on the table and sank into his chair, exhausted. The room was dark except for the lamplight spilling across his desk. And there, right in the center, lay a single white lily, still wet from rain. He didn't move for a long time. Maybe the experiment really had ended. Maybe, at last, they were together as one.